Rain stitched the river into shards of silver the day we buried my sister Lucy. I was still holding the folded program when I saw my father step off the gravel path, his polished shoes sinking into the mud as if the earth itself had stopped respecting him. In his hands was a small wooden box wrapped in white cloth, careful and deliberate, like he was placing a secret back where it belonged. My mother stood behind him, motionless beneath her black umbrella, her lips pressed tight against words she would never say. When my father let that box fall into the current, the water caught it gently as though it understood. I told myself it had to be empty. I told myself it had to mean something merciful. I was wrong. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to hold a family together when everyone else was breaking apart, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm Hannah Carter, born and raised in the town of Ashfield, where people still talk about families the way they talk about brands, polished, predictable, and best admired from a distance. My father built Carter Logistics, a shipping company that made him the kind of man other men wanted to impress. He used to say there were 3 rules to being a Carter: protect the family, protect the name, and protect the silence that protects both. Those words hung in our house like commandments carved into glass. You could see through them, but you couldn't ignore their edges. Growing up, I learned to keep my emotions neat and folded, just like the linen napkins my mother ironed every Sunday. We didn't shout in our house. We edited. We didn't cry. We made statements. My mother, Diane, was the quiet architect of appearances, always smoothing, always softening. She believed good manners could cover almost anything. For a long time, I believed her. Then there was Lucy. My little sister was the opposite of everything our last name demanded. Where I saw rules, she saw windows. She painted sunlight on every dull thing she touched and never once apologized for it. There was always color under her nails, and somehow she made that seem like courage. I used to envy the way she could walk into a room and make it warmer just by laughing. My father saw it as carelessness, a flaw to correct. The breaking point came the summer she brought home Ethan Miller, a mechanic from the other side of town. He had oil under his fingernails and a laugh that filled our cold dining room until it felt almost human. My father's polite smile hardened into glass. At dinner, he asked Ethan what drove him ambition, security, a 5-year plan. Ethan just smiled and said, "Joy." Lucy reached for his hand and said, "That's what I'm choosing, Dad, joy." That word landed like a curse. My father's fork paused mid-air. "Joy," he repeated as though it were a foreign language. Later that night he told me Lucy was losing herself, that she was throwing away everything he'd built. I told him maybe she was just choosing to build something of her own. He didn't answer, just walked away the way he always did, when a conversation refused to bow to him. From then on, the house changed. Curfews, rules, quiet punishments that didn't look like punishments. My mother fluttered between them, trying to keep the peace, trying to keep her daughters from shattering the reflection she'd spent decades polishing. By the time Lucy moved out, the air in that house had gone so still it felt like glass about to crack. Months later, she showed up at my apartment door, trembling, her hair damp from the rain. She told me she was pregnant. I made her cocoa like we were kids again and wrapped her in the old throw blanket we used to fight over. She said Ethan was looking for a second job, that they'd make it work somehow. When I felt the small kick under her hand, I believed her. But deep down I knew our father would never forgive what he saw as weakness wearing a smile. I wish I could say we had time to fix it to bridge that impossible space between love and pride, but the truth is, we didn't. The call came one cold evening, a hospital voice, calm and final. Complications, they said. Lucy was gone before they could even call Ethan. The next morning, my father sent me a funeral itinerary laid out like a press release. Everything was scripted, even the sorrow. I went through the motions, shaking hands, accepting condolences that sounded like contracts, until the moment he stepped toward the river with that box. My mother stayed behind, her face pale and empty. I remember thinking that grief shouldn't look so composed. Then the wind shifted, and from the direction of the water came a sound, faint, fragile, impossible. It was the kind of sound you don't forget, even if you try. And when I turned toward the river, the current was already carrying that box downstream. I didn't think. I just ran. The box drifted farther downstream before I could reach it. I stumbled through the mud, soaked past my knees, my fingers clawing through reeds until they found the slick edge of the wood. It was heavier than I expected, waterlogged, but solid. For a second, I just knelt there, the current brushing against my wrists, and told myself it couldn't be what I thought. Then a sound came from inside, thin, desperate, alive. My breath caught. I jammed my car key under the seam, pried the lid loose, and the world tilted. Inside, wrapped in damp cotton, was a newborn. His lips were pale, his breaths shallow, but his tiny fist twitched as if he was reaching for something he hadn't lost yet. I don't remember thinking, only moving. I stripped off my scarf and wrapped him tight, holding him against my chest. My father's voice came from behind me, rough and distant like gravel under steel. "Give him to me." When I turned, his face was calm in that practiced way that used to impress investors. "You threw him in the river," I said. He blinked, unbothered. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "Your sister's choices created a child." I cut in. "You mean a child?" My mother's voice trembled from the bank. "Richard, please." He didn't look at her. "We can fix this," he said, stepping closer. "Fix what I asked. He's not a stain." The baby whimpered again, soft but insistent. I clutched him tighter, turned toward my car, and ran. My mother didn't follow. My father didn't try to stop me. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was the two of them standing at the river's edge, one frozen by fear, the other by pride. The drive to St. Augustine's Hospital was a blur of wet roads and red lights that felt too long. I held the baby against me, whispering nonsense, counting breaths that barely stirred the air. When I burst through the ER doors, the nurse behind the counter, tough, broad-shouldered, the kind who could manage chaos without flinching, took one look and shouted for help. They whisked him from my arms, voices overlapping with medical words I couldn't process. Someone asked me what happened. I told them I found him by the river. They looked at me a second too long, as if deciding whether to believe me, then nodded and went to work. Minutes felt like hours. I sat in a plastic chair beside a vending machine that hummed louder than my own thoughts. When the doctor finally came out, his voice was steady. "Early distress, mild hypothermia, but responsive. You saved him." I let out a sound I didn't know I was holding. "I think he saved me," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure he heard. They called him Baby Carter because that's what I blurted out when they asked for a name. The words felt like a lie, but I couldn't take them back. I watched them roll his isolette down the hall, his tiny chest rising and falling under a warming lamp. For the first time since Lucy died, I felt the world tilt toward life instead of loss. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in that hallway until dawn, drinking stale coffee and staring at the doors every time a nurse passed. When they finally let me hold him again, I decided on his name, Lucas. It sounded like a bridge between her and us, a small piece of light that belonged to both. Signing the foster paperwork felt surreal, my hand shaking over each line like I was forging something sacred and dangerous all at once. The nurse smiled when I was done. "He's lucky," she said. I wanted to tell her it wasn't luck. It was love fighting for air. Back at my apartment, I set the bassinet beside my bed and learned what 3 a.m. sounds like when it's a cry instead of a siren. I fed him from bottles I barely knew how to hold, changed him with trembling hands, and fell asleep on the floor beside him just to keep my hand near his. When his tiny fingers closed around mine, it felt like something rewired inside me, like I'd been living on autopilot for years and suddenly found the switch. On the third morning, the hum of my father's car broke the quiet. I saw his reflection in the hallway mirror before I saw his face. He didn't knock. Men like him never did. I opened the door before he could. He stood there in his pressed coat, rein on the shoulders, his expression measured. "Enough," he said softly. "You've had your moment. Give me the child and I'll handle the necessary arrangements." His voice was calm, but the space between us felt like a wire pulled too tight. I stepped back just enough to block his view. Arrangements like drowning. The words came out before I could stop them. His jaw tightened. "Like discretion," he said. "Like not turning your sister's mistake into a headline." I could feel Lucas breathing against my chest, warm and steady now. "Lucy wasn't a mistake," I said. Something flickered across his face, fear, maybe shame, but it vanished before I could name it. "You'll regret this rebellion," he said. "I already regret not stopping you sooner." My mother appeared behind him, pale and exhausted. "Hannah," she whispered, "your father's scared." I nodded once. "So am I, but not of the truth." We stood there until the edge of the doorframe pressed into my back. He spoke again, quieter now. "You can't keep him. You don't understand what this will cost." I met his eyes. "Then I'll learn." He looked past me to the faint sound of Lucas breathing. "You'll need money lawyer's protection," he said. "I have friends." It was a lie, but it sounded strong enough to make him hesitate. He drew in a slow breath. "You're making yourself an enemy of this family." I looked down at Lucas, who was yawning, completely unaware of the war he'd started. "No," I said. "I'm making us into one." Then I closed the door and slid the lock into place. The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain outside. I stayed there for a long time, my back against the door, Lucas sleeping in my arms. My mother didn't knock. My father didn't call. It was as if they'd both vanished, leaving behind only the echo of everything we'd never said. By the next morning, the hospital called to check on him. The doctor said he was stable, strong. "He's a fighter," he said. I smiled, because of course he was Lucy's son. When the nurse brought me his discharge papers, I noticed the hospital bracelet still circling his ankle. The tag read, "Baby Miller." Seeing Ethan's name printed there made the air shift again. I realized he didn't know that his son was alive, that Lucy's story hadn't ended the way we'd all been told. My phone sat on the counter for an hour before I found the nerve to call. The first ring went to voicemail. The second rang longer. When he finally answered, his voice sounded worn and hollow. "Hannah," he said. "You need to sit down," I told him. He didn't. I heard the scrape of a chair, the echo of an empty room. Then I said it everything. The river, the box, the baby. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the line had gone dead. Then came a sound, half breath, half cry. "They killed my son," he said. "No," I whispered. "He's alive. He's safe." 38 minutes later, Ethan walked into the hospital, winded, eyes red. The nurse made him scrub in, then led him to the isolette. He stood there, one hand on the plastic, his shoulders shaking. "Lucas," he said softly, the word breaking in the middle. "Hey, little man." When he looked at me, there was no anger left, only something raw and grateful. Why, he asked. Just that one word. "Because Lucy would never forgive me if I didn't," I said. "And because I couldn't let him go." That night we made a plan the way desperate people do, quietly, methodically, without space for fear. Petition for emergency guardianship. Collect every record, every document. Keep a log of every call and threat. I'd learned to survive by organizing chaos, and now that skill had a purpose. We would fight for him no matter what it cost. As I held Lucas again before the nurses took him for tests, his fingers curled around mine, stronger than before. I whispered, "Good night, my tiny rebellion," and watched his chest rise and fall steady and certain. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streetlights made the wet pavement shine like glass. For the first time since Lucy's funeral, the night didn't feel like a wait, it felt like a promise. Ethan came every day after that first night at the hospital. He'd bring coffee for me and soft blankets for Lucas, then sit in silence beside the bassinet, his hands resting on his knees like he was still learning what to do with them. We didn't talk about the funeral or my father's threats. There wasn't space for that yet. Everything we said circled back to the baby, his breathing, the way he stretched his tiny fingers, the sound he made when he dreamed. Each detail was proof that he was real and still ours to protect. By the end of the week, we met with a hospital social worker named Marla Jennings, a calm woman with kind eyes who had the voice of someone used to steadying storms. She explained what needed to happen if we wanted to keep custody, emergency guardianship documentation, evidence of endangerment. Every word sounded heavier than the last. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, silent, until she asked if we had family support. He hesitated. I said we did. She didn't press for details, but I could tell she didn't believe me. She handed us a packet of forms and said softly, "Whatever story brought this baby here, make sure the truth is written somewhere." That night, Ethan and I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by paperwork. The lamp buzzed, and the only other sound was Lucas's breathing through the baby monitor. Ethan ran his thumb along the edge of a form. "Your father's not going to stop," he said. I didn't answer right away. "Then we don't stop either," I said finally. He nodded once, the kind of nod that meant he'd already decided. We divided tasks. He'd gather proof of paternity, I'd collect hospital records and witness statements. We both knew that whatever happened next would define everything that came after. 2 days later, the flowers started arriving. First, a white bouquet so large it blocked the light from my window, then a second one the next morning. No note. By the third delivery, the card came typed unsigned. "Congratulations on your charity." I stared at it until the words blurred. That night, my phone lit up at 2 a.m. It was a message from my mother. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I didn't reply. I couldn't. Lucas stirred in his sleep, his hand curling into a small fist, and that was answer enough. At dawn, his eyes opened fully for the first time. They were the same soft blue as Lucy's, clear and bright, like they'd been waiting for light. He blinked up at me, calm and curious, and I felt something inside settle. "Good morning, little one," I whispered. "You're safe." When the court date came, the sky was gray and restless, threatening rain. Ethan met me on the courthouse steps, his suit jacket slightly too big, his hair combed back like he was trying to look older than 28. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "we did the right thing." I nodded, though the weight in my chest made it hard to breathe. Inside, the family courtroom was smaller than I imagined. No gallery, just a long wooden table. 2 lawyers and a woman in black robes whose expression gave away nothing. Judge Marion Decker looked up from our file, her tone measured but not unkind. "Miss Carter, Mr. Miller, Mr. Carter." My father's lawyer, an older man in an expensive gray suit, stood first. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "the Carters stand ready to assume full responsibility for the child's welfare. My client's daughter died under tragic circumstances, and in the immediate aftermath, mistaken decisions were made by distraught individuals. The word mistaken echoed against the walls like a warning. The judge folded her hands. "Mistaken," she repeated. "In what sense?" The lawyer smiled faintly as if this were a boardroom. "The heat of grief, Your Honor. My client deeply regrets." She cut him off with a raised hand. "Show me the regret, not the performance." Then she turned her gaze toward me. "Where is the mother of this child?" The question landed hard. Ethan's hand twitched beside mine, but his voice was steady. "She's gone, Your Honor." The judge's eyes softened, then sharpened again. "I see," she said. "What I have before me is a newborn, a bereaved father with limited means, and a paternal aunt who has assumed temporary care. I also have allegations of abandonment." My father's lawyer started to object, but the judge didn't let him. "Sit down," she said flatly. Then to me, "Miss Carter, do you have evidence?" I swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "My statement and a video." My father's head jerked toward me. "Video," he said sharply. I nodded. "My dash cam. It records automatically when there's movement near my parking space. It caught my parents walking past carrying a box. It doesn't show the water, but it shows them returning with their hands empty." A murmur ran through the room. My father laughed once, short and harsh. A box could contain anything, he said. Then why I asked was, there a hospital bracelet on the baby's ankle with Lucy's and Ethan's names? The silence that followed was heavy enough to shake the air. Judge Decker leaned forward. "Mr. Carter," she asked. My father straightened his cuffs, his voice calm, practiced. "Your Honor, my daughter made choices that endangered herself and this family. My wife and I believed we were delivering the child to a safe haven. We panicked, we failed, but we can correct that now within the family where he'll have every resource." The judge stared at him. "Safe haven," she repeated, her tone cooling. "At a river." My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, I saw something that looked like cracks forming behind his composure. "Stand up," the judge said quietly. He did. "I am not a woman you can sell narratives to, Mr. Carter. I am a woman who counts facts, and the facts are simple. A newborn was found in a box in a river. His aunt risked her safety to retrieve him. His father came forward. The grandparents' actions are in question. She turned to Ethan. Mr. Miller, can you provide a stable environment? He sat straighter. Yes, Your Honor. I'm applying for a night shift at the plant. My aunt's a retired nurse. She offered to help with daytime care. I'll take parenting classes, whatever it takes. He's my son. Then she looked at me. And you, Miss Carter? I drew in a breath. I will support them. Financially, logistically, every way I can. We can live as a family if the court allows. The judge tapped her pen, once thinking. And the grandparents, she asked. I looked across the room. My father's eyes were cold, unreadable. My mother's hands twisted in her lap. Then she stood, her voice trembling. Your Honor, she said softly, we were wrong. The words barely reached the bench, but they broke something open in the room. We were so afraid of losing face that we lost our daughter, she said, her gaze falling to the floor. I won't lose our grandson. My father turned toward her, stunned. Diane, he said under his breath, but she didn't look at him. Judge Decker nodded slowly. Here is my ruling, she said. Her gavel hovered just long enough to make everyone in the room hold still. Emergency legal and physical custody is granted jointly to Mr. Miller and Miss Carter, pending a full review. Supervised visitation to the grandparents contingent on participation in counseling. A court-appointed investigator will visit all homes within 72 hours. Next hearing in 30 days. The sound of the gavel landing was soft but final. Ethan covered his face, shaking the first real tears I'd seen from him. My mother sat down hard, her shoulders collapsing inward. My father said nothing. As the bailiff opened the door, she turned to me and mouthed 2 words, thank you, then added a third, almost invisible, sorry. Outside, the sky finally broke. Rain came down bright and clean, washing the courthouse steps until they gleamed. Ethan reached for my hand. We did it, he said, voice thick. I nodded, though part of me knew it wasn't over. But for the first time, the weight in my chest felt lighter. The rain soaked through our clothes, and we just stood there, laughing quietly at how soaked we were, at how alive everything suddenly felt. That night, Lucas slept soundly for the first time. I sat beside him, the sound of rain against the windows, like steady breathing. The house was small and quiet, but it felt full. We had survived the storm, though I knew the river that started it all wasn't done with us yet. The morning after the hearing, I woke to quiet. Lucas was asleep in his bassinet, his small hands tucked under his chin, the soft rhythm of his breathing filling the apartment. The past week had felt like a storm that refused to end, but now there was a stillness, thin and fragile, like something that could shatter with the next knock on the door. I made coffee, stood by the window, and watched the rain-soaked street glisten in the early light. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing for something terrible. When Ethan arrived, he looked lighter, though the exhaustion never fully left his face. He's still asleep, he whispered, peeking over the edge of the crib. Lucas stirred but didn't wake. Ethan smiled. He sleeps like Lucy, he said. Barely moves, but you can tell he's dreaming. I nodded, remembering how Lucy used to fall asleep on the couch, with her paint still open beside her, as if the world wasn't finished yet, and she couldn't stop trying to make it better. We spent that day building a plan for the next 30 days before the court review. Parenting classes, financial statements, childcare schedules. The to-do list stretched across 2 pages, but it gave us something to hold on to. Ethan's aunt, a retired nurse named Margaret Lane, agreed to help during the days while he worked the night shift at the plant. I filed paperwork for family support, gathered receipts, and organized every document into a binder labeled Lucas's Future. It was tedious work, but every page felt like a promise. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Can I come by alone?" I hesitated before answering. When she arrived, she carried 2 grocery bags filled with food I hadn't asked for. Her eyes were tired, but her voice was steady. "I thought you might need a few things," she said, setting the bags on the counter. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked at Lucas sleeping in his bassinet, and something in her expression softened. "He has her smile," she whispered. She stayed for an hour holding him while I made tea. I watched her trace the back of his hand with her thumb as if memorizing proof that he existed. When she left, she paused by the door. "Your father's not ready," she said quietly. "He thinks talking to you means admitting he's wrong." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what to say. "He'll come around," she added. "He just doesn't know how yet." When the door closed, I realized she hadn't used the word if. She'd said when. It was small, but it was something. Days passed in a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. Ethan started his night shifts, coming home at dawn to take Lucas into his arms before I left for work. I'd hear them in the living room, Ethan's low voice humming off key, while Lucas made those soft baby sounds that didn't quite count as words, but felt like answers anyway. On weekends, we took walks to the park, the stroller wheels squeaking over the cracked sidewalks. Sometimes I'd catch people staring, probably recognizing my last name from news reports about the Carters. But no one said anything. They just looked away, and I was grateful for the quiet. One afternoon, as I was returning from a grocery run, I saw my father's car parked across the street. He was standing beside it, hands in his coat pockets, staring at the apartment building. For a moment, I thought about pretending not to see him. But then he looked up and the choice was gone. I crossed the street, heart pounding, and stopped a few feet away. "Dad," I said carefully. He nodded once. "Hannah." His voice was low, almost gravelly. We stood there in silence, the sound of traffic filling the gaps. Finally, he said, "You were always the troublesome one. I should have known it would be you." I didn't flinch. It had to be someone I said. I just got there first. He gave a tired half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was raised by a man who thought reputation was God," he said. "I sacrificed everything to that altar. You think I don't wake up hearing Lucy's voice?" His words trembled near the end, and for the first time I saw not the man who ran a company, but one who'd lost more than he could repair. Then why, I asked quietly. He looked past me toward the street. "Because power is a corridor," he said after a long pause, "and every door you walk through locks behind you. One day you turn around and realize there's no way back." His words settled between us like dust. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that there was always a way back, but I didn't. Not yet. He looked smaller then, like the world had finally stopped listening to him. "You humiliated me in that courtroom," he said. I met his eyes. "I saved your grandson," I said softly. "And maybe what's left of you." He let out a faint, broken laugh. "You won, Hannah." I shook my head. Lucas did. We stood there until the wind picked up, scattering a few leaves across the pavement. When I turned to leave, he didn't follow. By the time I reached the apartment steps, his car was already gone. That night, the counseling office called to confirm his first appointment. I didn't know if he'd show up. I wanted to believe he would. Weeks passed and life settled into something steady. Ethan worked, I freelanced from home, and Lucas grew stronger every day. He'd started to smile, real smiles, not the half-awake kind, and every time he did, it felt like light filling the room. My mother came by again this time with a small canvas she'd found in Lucy's room. It was unfinished, a swirl of color that looked like a sunrise. She started this the week before Mom said, her voice catching. He should grow up with her colors. She hung it above the crib, and for a moment, the apartment felt like Lucy was there, watching us figure out how to live without her. A week later, my father showed up at the door. He didn't call first. When I opened it, he stood there empty-handed. No briefcase, no rehearsed speech. "I won't stay long," he said. "I just wanted to see him." I nodded and stepped aside. He moved slowly toward the crib as if the air might break if he walked too fast. Lucas was sleeping. My father looked down at him for a long time. Then he cleared his throat. "I set up a scholarship," he said quietly, "in Lucy's name, for girls who want to study art and don't have fathers who can bear it." He swallowed hard. "If you'll let me, I'd like to start one for boys, too, for those with last names that don't open doors." Ethan, standing behind me, nodded. "It's a start," he said. My father nodded back. "I'll do the rest of the steps without being asked." He pulled a folded check from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "For the scholarship fund," he said. "Not the family." Then he left before either of us could respond. It took me 2 days to deposit the check, and when I did, I opened a new account in Lucas's name. I called it Rivers Change Course. I made my father sign an agreement making the funds irrevocable and public. He didn't argue. Not once. On Sunday morning, we took Lucas to the park. The air was crisp, the kind that hints at spring, even though winter hasn't finished saying goodbye. Ethan pushed the stroller while I carried a thermos of coffee. We stopped near the pond where the water shimmered under a pale sun. He sleeps through everything, Ethan said, smiling. He gets that from you. I looked at Lucas's tiny hand curled around the blanket. Or from Lucy, I said. Later that night, after we put him to bed, I sat at my desk and opened a blank page. Not for work, not for another report or statement. This was different. I began writing a letter. Dear Lucy, I wrote, we nearly lost him. We nearly lost us. But I think you'd be proud. We're learning how to breathe again. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater and Lucas's soft breathing down the hall. Outside, the streetlight flickered against the window. It wasn't peace yet, but it was close enough to believe it might be coming. It took a long time for life to feel like something we could trust again. Each morning started with the same quiet routine, coffee, soft lullabies, the sound of Lucas babbling in his bassinet as sunlight spilled through the blinds. Ethan worked nights at the plant, coming home at dawn to hold Lucas while I left for my office downtown. Our schedules overlapped just enough to make it work a rhythm built from exhaustion and stubborn hope. By the third month, I could feel the edges of our lives smoothing into something steady. Ethan's Aunt Margaret had become part of that rhythm too. She'd stop by most afternoons, humming old country songs while folding laundry or rocking Lucas until he drifted to sleep. Sometimes when I returned home from work, I'd find them all three asleep in the living room, Ethan still in his work shirt, Margaret's knitting on her lap, and Lucas nestled between them. It made the small apartment feel like a home that had been lived in for years. Still, the quiet carried tension underneath. Every phone call from an unknown number made my chest tighten, expecting to hear my father's voice or a lawyer's tone. But no one called. The court's 30-day review loomed ahead, and though I'd prepared every document, fear had a way of slipping through even the best plans. One afternoon, I came home early to find my mother sitting on the front steps, holding a small folder in her hands. She looked different. Her hair tied back, simply her usual pearls replaced with nothing at all. When she stood, I noticed her hands trembling. I didn't want to call, she said. I wasn't sure you'd answer. I let her in without a word. Inside, Lucas cooed from his crib, and she turned toward the sound instinctively. She held the folder out to me. It's from your father's attorney, she said. He's transferring part of his company shares into a trust for the scholarships. He wanted you to have the paperwork. I opened it, scanning the notarized documents. 2 new endowments, one in Lucy's name and one labeled Rivers Change Course. Each listed me as trustee. My mother's voice softened. He did it quietly, she said. He didn't want attention, just to make it right. For the first time in years, I saw something like honesty in her eyes, unpolished and uncertain, but real. He's trying, she said, looking down at Lucas. He's never been good at it, but he's trying. I nodded, unsure if I was ready to forgive him, but knowing this was a step neither of us expected. That weekend, Ethan suggested we take Lucas to the park again. The air had that early spring chill where the sun feels close, but the wind still bites. We spread a blanket on the grass, and for a while we just sat in the quiet. Do you think he'll ever really change? Ethan asked. I thought about my father's voice at the river, the sound of regret wrapped in pride. Maybe not all the way I said, but maybe enough to try again. Lucas giggled as a gust of wind caught the corner of the blanket, his laugh cutting through the stillness like something brand new. Ethan smiled. That's all we can ask for. The following week brought the court investigator to our apartment. Her name was Helen Cruz, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a kind smile. She moved through each room with quiet precision, noting safety rails, child-proof latches, and the framed painting Lucy had left unfinished. She asked questions, routine ones about income schedules, support networks, but her tone stayed gentle. When she finished, she sat on the couch and looked at Lucas asleep in Margaret's arms. He's healthy, she said, safe, loved, and thriving. That's all a court needs to see. She closed her folder, then smiled at me. You're doing well, Miss Carter. I felt my throat tighten, but I just nodded. When she left, I stood by the window for a long time watching her car disappear down the street. That night, Ethan came home earlier than usual. He found me still sitting at the table, surrounded by paperwork. "What did she say?" he asked. "That we're doing fine," I said. "That's all." I smiled faintly. Sometimes that's everything. A few days later, a knock on the door startled me out of sleep. When I opened it, my father was standing there again. He looked thinner, older, his suit hanging a little loose around the shoulders. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. He glanced toward the bassinet, then back at me. "I didn't want to see you like this," he said, "but I needed to know if what I started matters." "It does," I said simply. He nodded, his eyes glassy. "Your mother says you opened a separate account." I confirmed it, waiting for the lecture about control or image that used to follow every decision I made. But instead he just said, "Good. That means it's real." For the first time, there was no defense, no distance in his voice, just the quiet exhaustion of a man who had spent too long trying to win battles that didn't matter anymore. He looked around the apartment, taking in the framed photos, the warmth, the absence of marble floors and sharp corners. "She would have liked this," he said. I knew he meant Lucy. She always said our house didn't breathe. This place does. He stood for a while silent. Then he took out a small envelope and set it on the counter. "I wrote a letter," he said, "to the court, not to change anything, just to tell the truth. About the river, about fear, about the price of silence." His eyes met mine. "I thought you should know before they read it." He left quietly after that, the door closing without sound. I opened the envelope later that night after everyone was asleep. The letter was short, written in his precise, slanted handwriting. "I cannot undo what I did, but I can name it. I was wrong. My daughter saved my grandson, and in doing so, she saved me from the man I'd become." At the final review hearing, the judge read my father's letter aloud. The courtroom felt different this time, less like a battlefield, more like a place where truth had finally found a voice. Judge Decker looked at us over her glasses. "This case began with tragedy," she said. "But what stands before me now is not a tragedy. It's a family rebuilt." She granted full custody to Ethan and me, commending our cooperation and the grandparents' compliance with counseling. My father sat quietly beside my mother, his head bowed, hands folded. When the gavel fell, no one clapped, no one spoke. It was a silence that carried peace instead of fear. Outside, the sun was already setting. The air smelled like rain, though the sky stayed clear. Ethan lifted Lucas into his arms, and my mother hugged us both. Even my father stepped forward, awkward but genuine. "He's getting big," he said. I smiled. "He's got a lot to live up to." My father nodded. So do I. That night back home, I watched Lucas sleeping and thought about how far we'd come from that river. There were still gaps that couldn't be filled, and grief that couldn't be fixed, but there was also light, soft, persistent, and growing. Ethan leaned against the doorway, his voice low. "We made it," he said. I looked at Lucas, at the painting above his crib, and at the faint reflection of the city lights in the window. "Yeah," I said. "We did." But even as peace settled around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that one more chapter remained, the part where forgiveness met what was left of love, and we all had to decide what came next. Spring came slow that year, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. The days grew longer, but the air still carried the kind of chill that made you keep a jacket close. After months of hearings and reports, the custody ruling had given us something close to peace, but peace had a strange way of feeling unfamiliar. I'd wake up in the mornings, listen to Lucas breathing softly through the baby monitor, and realize how quiet life had become. It wasn't silence that frightened me anymore. It was learning how to live inside it. Ethan had started his permanent shift at the plant, and our schedules finally aligned again. We'd trade off one of us feeding Lucas while the other packed lunches or folded laundry. The rhythm wasn't perfect, but it felt real. Margaret still came by on Sundays, bringing casseroles that could feed us for a week. She'd tease Ethan for never remembering to salt the pasta water, and he'd grin the same shy grin that used to melt Lucy. Sometimes when the light hit just right, I'd catch him looking at Lucas with the same expression he once saved for her tender reverent, a little lost. My father kept his distance, though the scholarship programs were quietly growing. Each month, a new student name arrived in my inbox, girls and boys from families who didn't have the safety nets we'd once taken for granted. Every letter of thanks came addressed to the Carter Fund, but I always forwarded them to him. He never replied, not once. Still, I knew he read them. The way the envelopes came back sealed, but moved from the bottom of the stack on his desk to the top, was his version of acknowledgement. One Thursday evening, I found an envelope slid under my apartment door. Inside was a single photograph, Lucy as a teenager, paint-smeared, laughing, her arms slung around me at the county fair. On the back, in my father's handwriting, were 5 words. She would have been proud. No signature, no return address. But that was enough. A week later, my mother called. "He's been going to counseling," she said. "Every week. He doesn't talk about it, but he goes." There was a pause, soft and uncertain. He asked if he could see Lucas. With me there. I agreed on one condition, that it happen at the park, not the house. The day of the visit, the sky was washed in the kind of blue that almost looked painted. We chose a quiet corner of the park near the pond, where ducks drifted lazily across the water. When my parents arrived, my mother walked ahead, her hands full of small things, snacks, napkins, a blanket. My father followed behind her, slower than I remembered, holding a paper bag with a single toy, inside a wooden rattle carved into the shape of a bird. Lucas was half asleep in his stroller when they reached us. My father stopped a few steps away, waiting for permission. I nodded, and he crouched beside the stroller, his large hands awkward and careful. "Hey there," he said quietly. "I'm your granddad." The words seemed to surprise him, like he hadn't spoken it out loud before. Lucas blinked, reached out and grabbed his finger with surprising strength. My father froze, then let out a shaky breath that wasn't quite a laugh, wasn't quite a cry. We sat together longer than I expected. My mother told stories about Lucy, how she used to sneak downstairs at midnight to paint by the refrigerator light, how she'd tape her sketches to the pantry door like they were family portraits. My father listened, eyes distant but open. At one point he looked at me and said, "You were right about the river." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He looked down at Lucas, then at the pond. "It keeps moving," he said, "even when you wish it would stop." When they left, he lingered behind. "You won't believe me," he said, "but I think about that day every morning." His voice broke a little. "I thought I was saving us from ruin. Instead, I nearly drowned everything that mattered." He didn't wait for me to answer, just nodded once and walked away. That night I wrote back to the address listed on his scholarship forms. "You can see him again," I wrote, but this time not as penance, as family. I didn't expect a reply, but a week later a small box arrived. Inside was a copy of Lucy's favorite paintbrush, framed under glass with a note, for when he's old enough to choose what kind of world he wants to make. Months passed, and summer settled over Ashfield. Lucas turned 1 in June. We held a small gathering at the park, the same one where everything had started to mend. Margaret brought cupcakes, my mother arranged flowers, and Ethan grilled under a string of borrowed lights. When my father arrived, no one stiffened this time. He handed Lucas a small stuffed duck and said something to remember the water by. My mother smiled, relieved. For once, the air between us felt easy. After the guests left, Ethan and I sat under the trees watching Lucas chase bubbles. Margaret blew across the grass. "You think it's over?" he asked. I shook my head gently. "Not over," I said. "Just turned into something else." The following week, I met my father for coffee, our first one-on-one conversation in years. He'd chosen a quiet corner of a cafe downtown, his tie missing his sleeves rolled up. He looked like a man who had finally stopped rehearsing. We talked about small things at first, the weather, the scholarship applications, the way the logistics company was now being run by a younger board. Then he said, "I stepped down last month." He said it simply like it wasn't monumental. "They'll do better without me. I built it to last, but I never built myself to let go." He gave a small smile. "I'm trying to learn how." Before we left, he reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. "Thank you for giving me another chance," he said. "You didn't have to." I looked at him, the man who once ruled his world by silence, and said, "Neither did you." That evening back home, I sat in the nursery while Lucas slept. The last light of the day stretched across the floor, catching the colors of Lucy's unfinished painting above his crib. The swirl of oranges and golds looked different in that light, less like something incomplete, more like something still becoming. I thought of her, of the river, of all the ways we'd almost lost everything, and how somehow through all that breaking, something new had taken shape. Outside, the sky dimmed to blue-gray, and I could hear the faint hum of the city beyond the window. Ethan came in quietly, resting his hand on my shoulder. "He's lucky," he said. I shook my head. "We all are." As the room fell quiet again, I whispered goodnight to Lucy, not because I needed to, but because it felt like the kind of thing families do when they're finally learning how to love without fear. The summer faded into fall before I realized how much time had passed. The leaves along the river turned to copper, and the air carried that familiar chill that always made me think of Lucy, how she used to say autumn felt like forgiveness. Life had settled into something steady. Ethan worked full-time at the plant, and I had taken a remote position that let me stay home with Lucas during the day. The apartment was small, but the sound of his laughter made it feel wide as a world. One afternoon I stood by the window watching him take his first unsteady steps toward Ethan's outstretched hands. His tiny feet slapped the floor, his face lit up with triumph, and for a second I could almost see Lucy behind him, encouraging, smiling alive in the space she left behind. Ethan scooped him up, laughing. "You did it, buddy," he said. Lucas giggled, the sound bubbling out like sunlight. I took a picture, though I knew I didn't need one. That moment was already carved into something deeper than memory. My father had become a quieter presence in our lives. He still called every few weeks, never with advice or conditions, just questions. "How's the baby? Is he sleeping? How's Ethan's work schedule?" It wasn't small talk. It was learning to care out loud. My mother visited often, bringing homemade soup or new outfits she'd find on sale, insisting she wasn't spoiling him, only keeping him comfortable. Their love looked different now, unpolished, imperfect, but real in a way it had never been before. The scholarships had taken off faster than any of us expected. 2 girls and 1 boy had already enrolled that semester under the Carter Fund, each sending handwritten letters describing their dreams. One of the girls, Leah Johnson, wrote that she planned to study fine arts and that she kept Lucy's story pinned to her dorm wall as a reminder that joy was worth fighting for. Reading that letter, I felt something loosen in my chest. Lucy's name wasn't just surviving anymore, it was teaching others how to live. One evening in late October, Ethan suggested we all have dinner together, my parents, Margaret, and us. It would be the first time since the court ruling that we'd all sat around the same table. I hesitated, but agreed. We chose a small family restaurant near the edge of town, quiet enough to talk, but far enough from the city that we wouldn't run into anyone who remembered the headlines. When we arrived, the hostess led us to a corner booth. My mother greeted us first, wrapping Lucas in her arms, like she hadn't seen him in years, though it had only been 2 days. My father stood unsure of what to do with his hands, then reached for Ethan's hand and shook it. "Good to see you," he said. Ethan nodded. "You too, sir." For a moment it almost looked normal. Dinner started cautiously, weather work, small things. Then Margaret broke the quiet by complimenting the scholarship program. "Lucy would have loved that," she said. My mother's eyes softened. "She would have," she said quietly. My father nodded, tracing the rim of his glass. "It's the one thing I can do that feels honest." He paused, then looked at Ethan. "I wanted to tell you personally, the board approved a separate endowment for trade apprenticeships, mechanics, welders, engineers. It's in your name." Ethan froze. "Mine?" "You gave my daughter happiness," my father said simply. "It's about time that counted for something." No one spoke for a long moment. The waiter passed by refilling glasses, unaware he'd walked into a room holding its breath. Ethan swallowed hard, then said, "Thank you, sir." My father shook his head. "You don't owe me that word anymore." After dinner, we walked to the parking lot together. My father stopped by the car, looking toward the river that ran behind the restaurant, its dark water moving steady under the lights. "It's strange," he said, "how the same place that almost destroyed us keeps showing up when we start over." My mother touched his arm gently. "Maybe that's what forgiveness looks like," she said. He didn't answer, but I saw the way his shoulders dropped, the smallest sign of peace settling in. Later that week, we received an invitation to the scholarship banquet in the city. It would be the first public event under Lucy's name. I didn't want to go. At first, the thought of speeches and cameras made my stomach twist, but my father insisted. "It's her legacy," he said. "Yours too." The hall was bright with string lights and polished glass. Rows of tables filled the room, each marked with small cards that read, "The Carter Foundation." Standing at the podium, my father looked different. No prepared notes, no polished speech. He spoke quietly, almost as if he were talking to one person instead of hundreds. "This program began from loss," he said, "but loss when faced honestly can build something worth keeping. My daughter taught me that." The room went still. Lucy Carter chose joy. Today we choose to carry that forward. He stepped aside and motioned for me to join him. My legs felt unsteady, but I walked to the stage. I spoke about Lucy's art, about how she painted light even when life gave her shadows. I spoke about Lucas, how he reminded us that love doesn't end, it just finds a new shape. When I finished, the audience rose to their feet, clapping not for us, but for the story we'd finally learned how to tell truthfully. After the ceremony, as guests began to leave, my father stood beside me, watching Lucas in his stroller, fast asleep. "He'll grow up knowing where he came from," I said. "Yes," he said quietly, "but more importantly, he'll know where he's going." The next morning, Ethan and I took Lucas back to the river. The sun was soft on the water, and the reeds swayed like they were breathing. We stood near the same bend where everything had changed, the same place where my father once threw a box into the current. Ethan handed me a small bouquet of wildflowers. "For her," he said. I placed them in the water and watched them drift slow and certain, following the current toward open sky. Lucas reached for the river, his tiny hand stretching toward the rippling light. Ethan laughed. "He's not scared of anything," he said. "He doesn't have to be," I replied. "Not anymore." We stood there a while longer, letting the wind move through us. It didn't feel like morning anymore. It felt like something alive, something carrying us forward. And though the river kept moving this time, it wasn't taking anything away. It was giving something back. When we finally turned to leave, the flowers were still visible downstream, bright against the water. I looked back once more and whispered, "We're okay now, Lucy." The breeze shifted cool and familiar, and for a heartbeat it felt like she was there walking beside us. Winter returned quietly the way forgiveness often does. The trees along the river were bare again, their reflections wavering in the gray water. I hadn't been back since that day with Ethan and Lucas, when we let the wildflowers drift downstream. Now, almost a year later, the river looked calmer, still moving, still murmuring, but without the sharpness it once carried. We came together on a clear morning in early spring to mark the day Lucy was born. Ethan carried Lucas, now sturdy on his feet and curious about everything. My mother held a small bouquet of lilies, Lucy's favorite. My father walked beside her, his steps slow but sure, hands empty for the first time. There were no speeches, no apologies left to give. Just the sound of the water and the feeling that maybe this time we were all in the same place for the right reason. We stood near the bend where it had all begun. The spot still made my chest tighten, but it didn't hurt the way it used to. My father knelt beside Lucas, pointing to the river. "That's where your mama found her strength," he said softly, "and where we found ours." My mother placed the lilies in the current and whispered something only the water could keep. The flowers spun, caught the sunlight, and drifted away this time, carrying peace instead of loss. Afterward, we walked along the bank talking about ordinary things. My father mentioned the new students the scholarship had helped that year. My mother asked about Ethan's shift schedule. Nothing grand or profound, just the simple comfort of family conversation. When we reached the car, my father turned to me. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent years believing strength meant control. I think it actually means knowing when to stop fighting." I nodded, not because he needed agreement, but because I finally understood what he meant. Life moved on in small, gentle ways. Lucas learned new words faster than we could keep up. He loved to paint tiny hands smudged with color, grinning at every mess he made. My mother joked that Lucy must be laughing from wherever she was. Ethan built a small workbench in the corner of our living room, where Lucas liked to hand him toy tools and pretend they were fixing the world together. And my father, who once measured his worth in contracts and headlines, started volunteering twice a week at the community center, tutoring kids in business basics. It wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about doing something good without needing to be seen. On the first warm day of May, I took Lucas for a walk near the park. The cherry trees were blooming, soft petals falling around us like snow. He tugged at my hand, pointing toward the water. "River," he said, his voice bright with pride. I smiled. "That's right," I told him. "That's the river that changed everything." He laughed, chasing a petal that landed on his sleeve. Watching him, I realized Lucy had never really left. She lived in the way he reached for light, the way he filled silence with laughter, and the way he reminded us all that joy was still possible after ruin. That evening we had dinner with my parents. My mother set the table with mismatched plates, something she would have never done before, but it didn't matter. My father brought dessert, a simple apple pie he claimed he'd baked himself. When we sat down to eat, there was no tension, no fear of saying the wrong thing, just warmth. Lucas climbed onto his grandfather's lap, sticky fingers and all, and Richard Carter, the man who once measured life and reputation, didn't flinch when tiny hands left prints on his white shirt. He just laughed and said, "Guess that means I belong now." Later, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood on the balcony and looked toward the faint line of the river beyond the city lights. It shimmered under the moon, endless and alive. I thought about everything it had taken from us and everything it had given back. I thought about Lucy, about how her choice to follow joy had torn our lives open, and how somehow, through all that, breaking something stronger had formed in its place. Families don't come out of pain untouched. They come out changed, mended in uneven stitches, but held together by choice. I know now that justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like truth finding air. Sometimes it's a baby's first breath, a second chance earned the hard way, or a father learning to say "I'm sorry" without words. And sometimes it's just knowing you stopped the cycle before it reached the next generation. As I turned to go inside, I heard Lucas stir in his crib, murmuring something soft, half a dream. I leaned over him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "You're safe," I whispered. "You're loved, and you'll never have to wonder which matters more." The night settled around us, quiet and full. Somewhere outside, the river kept moving steady as ever, no longer a place of loss, but a song that belonged to all of us now. If this story touched you, take a moment to think about the people who helped you find your own way back to peace. And if you believe love can outlast even the hardest things, stay a while. There are more stories worth sharing.